Tonight, we will not list the names of gods as if they were carved in stone, nor weigh every prophecy that shivered through the north. Instead, we'll stand at the edge of a forest where the silence bends because something inside it is breathing. The air here feels taut, as though even the wind is waiting for permission to move. Shadows lengthen, not from the trees, but from a pup whose paws are already too large for his body. Fenrir, child of chaos, growing in the watchful gaze of gods who pretend not to fear him. This is not a tale of thunder yet, but of the quiet moments before thunder chooses its sky. So lower the lights and let the hush of the north fold over you like a heavy pelt. If your breathing falls in step with the slow rhythm of paws pressing into the earth, that's just the night carrying you closer to the wolf. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next chain forged in the dark will be waiting for you there. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next chain forged in the dark will be waiting for you there. And when it does, it won't just be metal and whispers, but the weight of every promise the gods dared not speak aloud. Chains and myths are never only iron, they are intentions, fears, and bargains twisted into shape. Each link is a decision, each knot a silence held too long. So if your eyes drift closed now, let them carry you into that forge, where sparks fall like stars, and where even the strongest bonds are only waiting for the right moment to break. Fenrir stands at the center of one of the darkest legends of the North. He was not always a horizon-sized shadow or a rumor whispered in fear. He began as an ordinary pup. His nose was black as a wet pebble, and he often fell asleep with his ears folded the wrong way. Born of Loki and the giantess Angraboa, Fenrir grew under the watchful eyes of the gods in Asgard, because watchfulness was one of the gods' oldest habits. They observed the way he ate, with the quiet ambition of something destined to grow. They observed the way he slept, paws twitching in pursuit of dreams that had not yet been invented. They noted the moment his shadow learned to follow him, the first bark that startled the rafters, the subtle way the wind seemed to arrive earlier whenever he stretched. Someone recorded his measurements in a tidy hand, head to tail, tail to hope, hope to horizon. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, likely submitted their own reports, perhaps complaining about the sheer number of bones scattered as toys. The gods grew in the habit of being quietly concerned, which is different from loud fear, the way fog is different from rain. There were little signs you might miss if you were busy polishing a spear, the way Fenrir's milk teeth looked a little like moon crescents found in the grass, the way he pushed his bowl across the floor without touching it, simply by leaning his attention in the right direction, the way the sun blinked whenever he yawned. They tried calling him by nicknames that sounded less like bad weather, Little Fang, Doorstop, Gentle Howl, but the names bounced off him the way a thrown apple bounces off a big coat. The Asir are famously good at pretending to be above it all, but even they went a bit quiet whenever the pup stretched and the room shrank around him. In those days, Tyr, who had a trustworthy face and a voice like warm bread, visited often. He understood that young things need rules and snacks in equal measure, and he offered both, sometimes in the same sentence. He taught Fenrir how to sit without making a crater and how to accept treats without changing the weather. He also measured the paw prints purely for curiosity, he said, and found they were whiter each morning, as if the night kept making room for him. The stories say Odin would gaze off toward the edge of the sky, where the world serpent did its long arithmetic, and say nothing. Silence can be a kind of policy. The quiet policy eventually turned into an errand. Let us make a chain, they said, that is less a chain and more a promise, the kind even a clever wolf would keep. The dwarves received the request the way competent people receive all unusual assignments, by making a list and adding tea to the list, even though tea is not technically an ingredient. They gathered 6 things that no one quite has, the way you gather the sound of a twig when it decides not to break. They took the footfall of a cat, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinew of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Each item is more available than it first appears. Cats have a way of walking through a room and leading behind the idea of a footstep. And if you have ever looked closely at frost, you know what a woman spirit might be when the north is in a generous mood. Mountains do have roots, though they keep them under miles of geology, and bears have tendons that behave like violin strings when you are respectful. Fish breathe with a seriousness that looks like listening, and birds are generous with spit when the conversation turns to nesting. The dwarves braided these soft impossibilities until they had a ribbon named Glipnir, light as promise and strong as a plan made in the morning. It looked like something you could use to tie a package, and everyone felt a bit better simply because it came with a receipt. On the back, someone had written in a small neat hand, "No refunds after Ragnarok." A ribbon, however, is only as good as the story you tell about it, so they told Fenrir it was a game. They had tried heavier chains before, thick as tree trunks, etched with oaths, and he had snapped them the way boredom snaps a twig. This time they smiled the polite smiles of people who have brought a magic trick to a nervous dinner. Fenrir, who had adopted Tyr as the kind of friend you grow toward, sniffed the ribbon and felt the tiny weight of its impossible ingredients. He could tell there was cleverness here. He said it in the slow grammar of a creature who has learned the language of those who feed him, that he would allow the binding only if one of them placed a hand between his teeth, not in hunger but in trust. It is one of the quiet jokes of fate that the god of law and oaths understood this sort of contract best. Tyr set his hand where the wolf's breath warmed it, and for a long breath no one moved, because stillness is the easiest way to share the same idea. Gleipnir slipped around Fenrir like a memory of being small, and because memories hold more firmly than iron it held. When the wolf realized the trick, he closed his mouth with the same decisiveness that ends a sentence. There's very little more to say about it. Tyr's hand went from being a hand to being a story, and he wore the story calmly. A craftsman Asgard rubbed balm into a brand new glove with one finger missing and, without thinking, added a second thumb to the pattern, then nodded to himself and called it symmetrical. The wolf lay down. He did not struggle. The ribbon did not creak. Even the sky relaxed, as if it could finally set down a bag it had been carrying too far. Meanwhile, prophecies kept their own gentle schedule. In the north, seeing the future is not a sport, but a kind of housekeeping. You hang what you know on a line and let the wind read it. A Volva would sit with her distaff, drawing out threads so thin you could hear it hum, and speak of days when the sea would forget its manners and the ash tree would loosen its crown. She would speak of a ribbon that could hold a wolf until the hour when holding would no longer be part of the weather, and of a one-eyed god who loved questions as if they were kin. It is not helpful to imagine the end of the world as a cliff. In these prophecies, it is more like the end of a broom where the last bristles give a small shrug. Names wandered through the verses like quiet guests at a long table, Thor polishing a hammer that always returned like a good email, Freyr counting his remaining options, Heimdall listening so hard you could hear the listening, and of course the lines that mention a wolf and a father of many things meeting as if by appointment. Some days the gods treated all this as weather, checking the runes the way farmers check the cloud line. Other days Odin would sit very still, tapping once on the wood of his chair, as if to see whether echoes were in the mood to be helpful. It's a peculiar thing to be destined to meet someone, and more peculiar when your calendars are written in seasons and dreams. Fenrir grew in his patience as much as in his size. Birds learned to use his fur as windbreaks. Snow drifted against him and didn't melt, not because he was cold, but because he had acquired that quiet temperature of large stones and unhurried mornings. Sometimes they say Tyr would bring stories and read them aloud, turning pages with his remaining hand and his patience. On one page, there would be mention of Vidar, a god who did not speak much, who was already collecting the offcuts of leather from every shoe made in Midgard to stitch into a single shoe without seams. It is an odd detail until you notice how many little strips are trimmed in a day, and how every cobbler must have paused at least once looking at the small heap and thought someone is going to want these. On another page, there would be a drawing of a forest growing in all directions, including up through its own shade. On another, a note that the son had a daughter who kept a spare sunrise in her pocket, just in case. In this way, destiny feels less like a trap and more like a pantry, always stocked with just enough for breakfast. Odin sometimes visited the place where the ribbon lay bright against dark fur and said nothing. When you have given up an eye for knowledge, you learn to let silence do its share of speaking. Once, perhaps, he tucked a small charm under the ribbon, the way someone might tuck a note into a coat before winter, not to change anything, but simply to be decent. If you are the kind of person who enjoys the subtle noises of old knots considering their options, you would have enjoyed the sound of Gleipnir on that last morning the world remembered to be the first. It wasn't a crack or a snap. It was closer to the little sigh a shoelace makes when it stops pretending to be a bow. The ribbon had not failed. It had completed its promise, which feels like the same thing until you look at the receipts. Around the edges of things, other edges stirred. The sea, which had been practicing for years, put on its taller hat. Mountains tried out new postures the way chairs do when you get up after a long sitting. Fenrir stood and stretched, producing that very long groan that large furniture produces when it remembers being a tree. He did not leap or rage. He simply walked, and wherever his paws landed, you could hear the old cat's footfall, which is to say very little at all. If you had been close, you might have noticed the ribbon, now loosened, wrap itself into a coil like a satisfied snake, and roll away to a drawer where impossible things are stored with mothballs and formal apologies. There are songs that make this moment sound like a hammer hitting a bell, but if you're listening to fall asleep, think of it more as a page being turned by someone careful with paper. About the meeting that followed, restraint is useful, not because it is terrible, but because the event has been narrated loudly enough elsewhere to last several winters. The one-eyed god approached on a horse that enjoys storms the way some people enjoy clapping, and the wolf, who had slept beneath prophecy long enough to know its ceiling, lifted his head. Worlds do not end like doors slamming. They end the way a hearth goes out with the faintest of moth-wing sounds when the final spark decides it has said enough. The swallow that poets describe is emerging more than a bite, an overlap the way a very large shadow briefly includes a candle. If there was fear, it was the kind you have before a haircut. You know it will be different after, and you are trying to be polite about it. Vidar was there, quiet as the inside of a glove. He wore that stitched shoe made from centuries of small leather trimmings, and with it he found his place where the calendar had left it for him. Some say he pressed the wolf's jaw apart using the shoe and a patient wedge. Some say he stepped into a space where the story let him, and the wolf's mouth remembered how to be open. Either way, the scene had the calm of a well-rehearsed stage change. Even the sun, busy with her spare sunrise, peeked over the curtain and then pretended she hadn't. Afterward, the air behaved like air again, which is one of the best things air can do. The wolf's breath, which had been weather, went back to being wind. The ribbon, perhaps, took up a new job as the line that holds the morning in place. Odin's absence felt like when you set down a heavy book and noticed the table is lighter, and yet the story is still inside you making small arrangements. People sometimes ask about endings, but that is for daytime. At night, it is more helpful to remember the details that are deliberately unimportant. That the dwarves kept the teacup they had used while braiding Gleipnir. That Tyr learned to tie knots with one hand and invented a new type of knot that never slips, but is easy to untie. That somewhere a cobbler woke with the odd feeling that he could stop saving those leather strips. If you happen to be awake, which is unlikely, you might consider the way the cat's footfall ingredient still lingers under every quiet step, which is why hallways at night sound like conspiracies between slippers. The North enjoyed its inventories: a wolf, a ribbon, a hand missing from a glove, a shoe made of leftovers, a sky that does what skies do. And if there are other mornings after this one, and there usually are, they will need precisely as much telling as you wish to give them. You can imagine the wolf lying down once more, larger than before and also smaller, because things tend to adapt to the story they fit. The ravens continue to file their reports, untroubled by new supervisory structures. Somewhere a mountain murmurs to its roots, which take their time replying. Somewhere else you are still breathing, which counts as a kind of prophecy that keeps renewing itself without fuss. And if we keep speaking like this softly with ribbon words and gently stitched shoes, perhaps, the night will tighten its laces and settle, and the world, which prefers to be patient, will agree to keep you a little longer until you slide down into the place, where even wolves are small again and the chains are only the loose, kind arms of sleep. You might not expect that a ribbon lighter than a sigh could outthink a wolf, but in the North, unlikely is mostly another word for comfortable enough to try. The gods had been keeping a careful eye on Fenrir, which is a polite way of saying they measured his shadow as if it were a growing child's height on a doorframe. He ate with the tidy focus of a wood stove, slept the way a hill sleeps, and woke each morning slightly larger than furniture had anticipated. None of this was immediately alarming. Asgard was a big place with a flexible floor plan, but there came a day when the rafters discovered they were listening for his breath, the way you listen for weather. The talk around the high tables grew softer, not because anyone wished to scold the pup, but because soft voices help you count ideas. Count enough ideas, and eventually someone suggests a ribbon. It started, as many practical miracles do, with a letter to the dwarves. Odin did not write it himself, his handwriting contains two. Much weather, but the message was simple. We need a binding that is not really a binding, something that persuades more than it pushes. The dwarves, who prefer requests that are both impossible and specific, set a kettle to singing and fetched a clean page. They have a workshop that sounds like rain turning into moss, all little hammers and thoughtful pauses. A foreman with a measuring stare read the god's request twice and said, "Ah," the way you say "ah" at a recipe that calls for the patience you have been saving. If you're still awake in a few minutes, and if the sound of dwarves putting on aprons hasn't already tucked you in, you could subscribe for more of these sleepy errands, or you could let the future deliver them to you on a quiet algorithmic breeze. Either method is perfectly acceptable to the elves who manage the paperwork. Their plan required 6 ingredients that exist like good manners present, but only noticeable when absent. First came the cat's footfall. Not the paw, not the pad. Just the sound a cat does not make when it decides to become air between one stair and the next. Dwarves are excellent listeners. They set a saucer of milk next to a staircase, and later poured the milk back into a bottle. And in the empty saucer was the faintest print of silence. They scraped it up with a spoon designed for collecting hush. Then the beard of a woman, which in the North is less an oddity than a seasonal choice. They visited a hall where winter makes lace on the window panes and gathered the pale filaments that bloom at the corners of smiles on a cold morning. Into the basket they went, weightless but present. After this came the roots of a mountain, those deep, patient lengths of stone that anchor a rock to itself. You do not dig for such roots. You speak to them through your boots and wait while they push up one small thread, curious to see what you will do with it. The sinew of a bear is easier. You ask politely, and the bear nods in that way bears have when they are sure. You will put it to good use and return the favor when berries are in season. Fish breath is gathered at dawn when scales are practicing their mirror work. You lean over the water with a jar and catch the first 3 exhalations of an attentive trout. As for bird spittle, anyone who has ever watched nest building knows birds are generous with glue. A dwarf with a feather behind his ear stood patiently beneath a pine until the air itself felt adhesive. They kept the 6 things in labeled tins because even magic relaxes when everything has a place. The tins made a sound when opened like folded paper being forgiven. They weighed nothing on the scale but felt heavy in the hands, a reminder that certain materials choose their own units of measure. The foreman laid out a length of nothing on the table, which is to say he cleared a space. Then the braiding began. 3 strands of absence, 3 strands of almost. Cat footfall twined with bird spittle, a duet of balance and adhesion. Mountain roots thinning bare sinew strength, convincing strength to go for a walk. Fish breath weaving through woman's beard, the shimmer of attention persuading the world to hold still. They braided slowly, stopping every now and then to sip tea and write down what the braid was teaching them, because good tools are also teachers, and dwarves collect lessons the way children collect round pebbles. By evening, they had something you can mistake for gift wrap, soft as a promise made before breakfast. They named it Gleipnir. Names matter, and this one sounded like a small bell ringing inside a walnut shell. It did not clink when lifted. It whispered the way snow whispers when it decides to exist. There is a superstition in every workshop that the thing you make will behave according to how you talk about it while you make it. So the dwarves spoke to Gleipnir like an old friend who knows better than to show off. They did not boast about strength. They complimented its gentleness. They did not predict victory. They admired how well it would suit a wrist. When they were finished, they wrapped the ribbon in a square of soft cloth and added a note that read, "Care, do not wander. Do not explain. Apply with trust." To this they attached an invoice with a line item that said, "Miscellaneous inevitabilities," and a courteous warning, "No returns after the sky takes a deep breath." It is comforting, in a bureaucratic way, to imagine that even fate has a receipts drawer. Deliveries to Asgard usually arrive on ravens, but ravens prefer parcels with corners, and Gleipnir had none. So the ribbon traveled by whisper hand to hand, then hand to thought, and finally thought to table until it lay before the gods, looking like an innocent accessory. The Aesir had already tried chains that were more brag than bondage links like knucklebones. Studs like thunderheads, each snapped by Fenrir as easily as you or I unfasten a troublesome opinion. This ribbon did not feel like those chains. It felt like the inside of a glove that fits, and that, curiously, made it seem trustworthy. Trust is an odd tool to bring to a task, but sometimes it is the only one that fits into the tight places. Tyr understood this. He had the pleased look of someone whose hunch has turned into an object you can put on the table between the butter and the bread. The others discussed tactics in the calm voice of people choosing seating at a long wedding feast. A plan should be arranged like cutlery. The important thing is that everyone knows where to reach without thinking. They invited Fenrir to a game, and because he liked games that involved being admired, he came. He was enormous by then in the way that mountains are enormous inside themselves, even when they look like ordinary hills from far away. Still, he had a puppy's appreciation for praise and a very clear sense of fairness. He sniffed the ribbon. It smelled faintly of every careful thing that had gone into it, of cats not making noise, of birds choosing to be architectural, of fish appreciating oxygen, of bears doing Pilates, of mountains keeping time. He understood that it was clever. Clever is not an insult to a wolf. It is a taste you roll around on your tongue to see if it pairs with meat or with moonlight. He said he would allow the trial if one of them would place a hand in his mouth during the binding, not as food, but as collateral, in case the joke turned sharp. Collateral is a very modern-sounding word for a very old need, to know where the vulnerability is and to ensure it is shared. There was never any doubt which god would answer. Tyr's trustworthiness was not a ceremony. It was a posture. He had the calm wrists of someone who ties an even bow on packages. He also had, and this is important, a very patient laugh. He stood before Fenrir and opened his hand, palm up, because palms say more about intention than any speech. The wolf lowered his head and accepted the hand the way you accept a bookmark, not to keep, but to be sure the story will be right where you left it. Around them, the others moved with the quiet efficiency of people laying a tablecloth. Gleipnir went around Fenrir's forelegs like a rumor that turns out to be true, then around his neck as a memory of being small, and finally around the two in such a way that the wolf found his posture becoming stillness. The ribbon did not tighten. It simply asked everything it touched to agree to remain exactly as it was. Agreement, it turns out, can be stronger than iron. For a breath or two, the world held its own breath. Then Fenrir tested the ribbon with a motion that felt polite, and discovered that politeness is a kind of strength when woven correctly. He realized the trick. Of course he did. He also realized that the hand in his mouth was a promise with teeth. Promises, like bread, are best when shared. Still, he closed his jaw. The bite was not an eruption. It was a decision, the kind you make when you find a clause in a contract that you admire but cannot accept. Tyr did not shout. He simply moved slightly backward into a new arithmetic. Later, a smith would fashion a glove with a space where a hand wasn't, and the glove would fit as if the absence had always been part of the design. If you have ever cut off the ragged fray on a sweater and discovered it sits better that way, you understand the vibe. It is odd to say this about a wound, but the scene felt organized. Even the grass, watching, lay down in tidy lines. The gods anchored Gleipnir to a boulder, and then, not out of meanness, but out of a wish for responsible gardening, they tied that boulder to a deeper thing beneath it. This is often how one secures a problem, to something heavy, and then beneath the heavy thing to an idea. It is frequently effective. Fenrir rested his chin on the ground and began the long practice of patience. Patience has many poses. The lake that waits for dawn to repeat itself. The stove that knows there will be more wood. The hand that learns to tie knots one-handed because it has to. Tyr practiced those knots. He developed a loop that fastens itself by listening difficult to explain to apprentices, but delightful once learned. Sometimes he brought bread to the wolf and held it in his good hand until the breath warming his knuckles told him the moment had become calm again. The ribbon held. It had the personality of a very competent librarian. Quiet, unyielding, present whether you notice it or not. There is an oddly domestic quality to myth when you look at it sideways. Someone mends a torn tunic. Someone keeps a list by the door of odd shoelaces to save for a future project. Someone remembers to oil the hinges of the gate near the bound wolf so that the squeak does not suggest cruelty. If you stand at a reasonable distance, you can hear the faint music of maintenance. The ravens reported each evening in tidy bulletins, though not the kind we put on paper, about how many shoemakers in Midgard trimmed leather from Solace that day because Vidar, S. quiet plan needed such trimmings for a shoe too serious to be discussed at dinner. The Norns watered the roots of the world tree as if it were a houseplant on a window ledge. And the water talked to the wood in the way old friends talk, with all the urgency of a rocking chair. In that environment, even betrayal sounds like a scheduling issue. Even sacrifice, while not minimized, shares a bench with practicality. If the wolf rumbled now and then, it was often because a bird had nested in his fur and he wished to reposition the nest more symmetrically. From time to time, someone would ask Tyr whether he regretted the cost of trust. He would look down at his one hand and say, "It makes the bread easier to hold," which is exactly the sort of remark that means nothing until you need it. He didn't become a different god. He became a version with fewer options but slightly better aim. Children in Asgard learned new games that required tying ropes with one hand and soon a generation grew up expert at tasks their elders had never considered. This is how sacrifice goes on paying, not loudly but persistently, like a warm coin in a pocket. And while there were prophecies on the shelves, carefully labeled, dusted on Thursdays, the room they furnished did not feel like a prison. It felt like a waiting room where someone has thoughtfully put out water, and the magazines are out of date by just the right amount. Leipner itself aged beautifully, which is a sentence you do not usually get to say about metal, except this was not metal. The ribbon kept its color the way long friendships keep their jokes. It did not fray because there were no loose ends to begin with. It had been woven from carefully gathered vacancies. Sometimes a god passing by would touch it with a fingertip for luck or for grounding. The way you might touch the doorframe of a house that has always let you in. At night, the ribbon made a tiny sound like pages turning themselves. No one could swear it was real, but those who believed it claimed they slept better for hearing it. And so the days went, and if this sounds uneventful, that is the point. The binding of a great wolf turned into a rhythm of polite visits and practical chores, into stories told at a considerate volume, into a new fashion in gloves. The dwarves received a thank you note written in gold ink that never cracked, and they framed it next to the recipe card on which they had written, cat footfall, skim, mountain root, ask nicely. Fenrir lay like a small hill with a ribbon around it and learned the art of the long exhale. The gods, who had been worried, learned instead to be punctual. As for us, we can notice the small, odd comfort available in a chain made of hush and courtesy. It is not dramatic. It is not even particularly photogenic. But it holds the way bedtime holds, by steady suggestion rather than force. And if you drift now, before the next part where old thread becomes prophecy and quiet patience becomes a calendar, that is perfectly fine. The ribbon will remember your place, and the wolf will nod as if to say that this too is a kind of trust worth keeping. You might not expect the end of the world to be kept like a tidy weather almanac, but in the north, the future is filed with the same care as winter socks. At the roots of the ash tree, where water remembers everything, 3 sisters sit with a loom that behaves like a good listener. They mark what will be with threads that are not exactly threads and knots that are better described as gentle decisions. When people speak of prophecy, they imagine trumpets. What you hear at the well is more like knitted silence, the kind that makes a room warmer without changing the temperature. One sister dips a ladle and waters a root, another smooths the skein so it doesn't snag on yesterday, and the third keeps the ledger. She writes with a stylus that leaves marks in the air, neat as grocery lists. One long winter, then another, then that extra winter that arrives like a guest who forgot their hat. She does not hurry. She is counting, but softly, as if counting sheep for the sky. The gods come by like neighbors who pretend they were in the area anyway. They stand with their hands behind their backs so they won't touch the loom, because everyone has learned what happens when you tug at destiny to see if it's attached. The ravens bring small reports that sound like folded maps being opened, and whatever they say is copied into the margins. There's an entry about the sea remembering how to climb, and another about wolves that run ahead of darkness as if they were tugging it on a string. The sisters mark these without drama, and it has a calming effect, the way labeling a box winter recipes makes you less afraid of November. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to more of this administrative foreshadowing, or you can allow it to drift by like steam above tea. Either way, the sisters will keep their notes in a legible hand. Prophecy is not one book, but a habit of careful people. A fisherman notices that the moon looks like a polished bone and, without meaning to, hums the same tune the Norns were humming earlier. A shepherd counts his flock and finds that the number keeps wanting to be a different number. So he counts again, and this time the sheep are satisfied, but the horizon has moved. Somewhere a vulva settles on a carved chair, the kind that creaks only enough to agree with her and draws a circle in the ashes on the floor. She speaks of a final snow that crunches like new bread and doesn't melt when you ask it to. She mentions a hall whose roof glitters with shields laid like shingles, which is more interior design than wording, but it helps to imagine a place correctly before you go there. She smiles because people listening expect thunder, and she chooses instead the comprehensible drama of pantry shelves stocked exactly for the number of guests that will arrive. All the while, small omens wander in like cats. An axe head rests into a pattern that looks suspiciously like a map of the world, and in the corner where the rust is darkest, there is the faint outline of a wolf's ear. Wind takes the smoke from a cooking fire and rearranges it into the shape of a boot with an extra thick sole, as if even the breeze has heard that a certain shoe will matter later. Children chase each other through snowdrifts and accidentally invent footwork that resembles the steps you take to stand inside the mouth of fate without bumping your head. None of this alarms anyone for long. It is understood that the horizon often leaves hints for the patient. They simply add a line to the ledger. Note, signs continue, pleasant to watch, not yet urgent. Odin, who prefers to keep his worries alphabetized, collects these lines like a librarian with a taste for quiet inevitabilities. He stores them next to the fragments of songs he paid for with the light of an eye, and binds the stack with a thong of leather he tells himself is temporary. He knows that the future likes to be courted, so he courts it methodically. Consultations with women who know how to listen from inside a circle of chalk. Long helpful silences with the dead, who are patient mentors. And the habit, which Frigg pretends not to notice, of standing very still when the house is empty to feel the floor tell. Hymn secrets planks tell only to people who remember to remove their boots. The Norns do not speak directly to him. There are rules about office hours, but the water in their basin has a reflective personality. And if you stand at the right angle, you can sometimes read a headline. It is never world to end. It is more lines of winter continues with conviction. Plan accordingly. Because he is thorough, he rehearses. He tries on ways of losing that do not feel like defeat. Writing a poem where the last line is left blank, and the blank means everything. Arranging a table for a guest who does not come and noticing that the chairs enjoy facing each other anyway. Some evenings he takes the long way home past the place where the wolf lies bound, not to stare, but to monitor the gardening. The ribbon looks well, he thinks, like a rule that is content to be obeyed. Fenrir watches him in the drowsy way mountains watch, and Odin nods back. Two specialists sharing notes across a very wide desk. When the ledger turns to the pages about the great ending, the handwriting does not change. It lays out the events like a recipe you can make from pantry items. Take a winter that forgets to leave, add a pinch of famished wolves, stir in a sudden, on a sea, and set aside until the sky requests fire. There is a mention of a horn that will be blown responsibly, not as a prank. And a line about ships built from the nails of the unburied, which is unpleasant, yes, but with the practical addendum that this is why you tidy graves. The phrases wolves swallow sun and moon, and gods meet what they have been expecting, sit together as comfortably as salt and flour in a bowl. If the gods glance at the part that names the wolf, who unthreads the Allfather, they do so the way you glance at a calendar, date you have known about for years. Unstartled, a little respectful, mentally composing the packing list. It is quietly interesting, and perhaps a little funny in a dry way, that the destiny of a god and the appetite of a wolf are recorded in the same ink as when the barley harvest should begin. There's even a footnote about footwear. Someone no one admits to authoring it has made a standing order to collect offcuts from shoemakers. The little crescents and commas of leather that fall like punctuation to the floor. Boys sweep them up with serious faces. Cobblers drop them into waiting bags as if feeding a pet that is shy of sudden moves. Vidar is not named in the paragraph, but the future shoe makes itself comfortable there, like a guest sitting down before introductions. Prophecy loves this kind of administrative courtesy. Word drifts through Midgard as tidily as laundry on a good drying day. In some farmhouses, old women tuck a sprig of rowan above the door, not because it will scare doom away, but because ragbberries are cheerful. In halls, skalds practice verses that could be spoken even if the wind took the roof off. They aim for a tone halfway between lullaby and inventory. Children learn to braid ropes one-handed because it as a diverting skill, and because a certain god has made it fashionable. Quietly, pleasantly, people get ready for a day that is not on the calendar yet, the way you set an extra bowl on the table out of habit. Doom, seen from this angle, looks a lot like hospitality. As for the wolf, his role in the prophecies is written without adjectives, which is one of the kindest ways to write. The wolf will swallow the mighty one, it says, and leaves it there like a page marker. You might expect sharpened capitals. The scribe prefers lowercase. Fenrir himself probably doesn't read the entries. Wolves are more auditory learners, but his dreams nose around the margins. Sometimes he dreams of a sky that tastes of iron and of a path that is almost a hallway, and in the dream he is not angry so much as punctilious. There's something to be done, and it is to be done by him, and he is very good at tasks when the instructions are clear. He wakes with his chin on the earth and the ribbon in its proper place and blinks, the way you blink after remembering all the words to a song you didn't know you knew. Odin reads that same line and thinks about recipes again. He has always liked the part of cooking where you let the dough rest. The books advise patience there, and patience is an activity he can practice without alarming anyone. He tells himself that being swallowed is simply a form of being kept, and that somewhere there may be lines yet unwritten in which kept things speak. Frigg once teased him that he talks to the future as if it were a shy animal, and he accepted the compliment. He has caught more than one truth by looking away and pretending to be interested in clouds. On long afternoons, the prophecies expand a little, not because the events change, but because careful people keep noticing additional textures worth capturing. A page is added about how the world will smell on that day clear, like split pine. Sweet as if every hive had just said yes at once. Someone writes down that spears will move as if remembering swimming lessons. Someone else writes in a precise hand that the wolf's breath will not be hot. It will be steady, like a tide coming in on time. These are not frightening details. They are comforting, the way knowing a train schedule is comforting even if you are not traveling. A very small drawing of a shoe appears in the margin with arrows pointing toward the sole, and underneath it a note. Thick. No one debates it. The page smells faintly of leather and glue. The Norns keep turning pages that do not curl. They prefer that nothing be smudged. Every so often, one of them removes a thread from the loom and sets it aside to dry, the way you set aside a slice of bread because you know you'll want toast later. They store those threads in a lidded jar labeled after, which is a practical word disguised as a hope. Sometimes the jar catches the sun and sends a small stripe of light across the bench where the ledger rests, and whoever is nearby takes it as a good omen and writes a little meter. The well burbles in a satisfied way. It likes it when the handwriting is clear. Across the meadow of years, the ribbon holding the wolf doesn't weaken so much as accept that everything has a season. You can tell when an enchantment is aging well because moss chooses to live on it. Travelers sit a respectful distance away and share bread. A woman with a basket of twigs pauses and adds a straight one to a pile, thinking of the ship mentioned in the prophecies and believing sincerely that straight lines are a kindness to any builder. Living or dead, she hums. The song ends on a note that suggests the next note without insisting on it. And so the ledger fills, not to overflow, but to sufficiency. Prophecies about the great winter and the neat shoe and the wolf who will keep the Allfather. For a while are sandwiched between notations about when to plant barley and the reminder to bring in the goats before the night wind changes its mind. The future is large, but the handwriting is small and patient. If drowsiness begins to gather at the corners of your eyes now, you are in good company. Even the ravens nod on the fence post as if sleep were another kind of omen. The page you are on does not demand to be turned. It will wait, polite as a well-balanced knife on a cutting board, until the kitchen is quiet again and someone has time to read aloud what was always going to be there. Not a shout, not a surprise, only the next careful line in a book that is not finished and does not need to hurry. You might expect the last day to begin with thunder, but in the north, it starts with a ribbon sighing like a sweater that wants to be a scarf again. Kleipner, the impossible bond, doesn't snap in any dramatic way. It loosens politely, as if a rule had remembered it was only a suggestion. The wolf feels the give the way you feel a doorknob turn from the other side. No rush, just certainty, and he tests it once, the way a careful person tries a step on a winter path. The ribbon slides through his fur with the sound of a cat passing between chair legs. Around him, frost keeps its appointments. Ice beads cling to heather as if the flowers were wearing pearls to watch the day go by. If you're still awake a few minutes from now, you can subscribe to more updates from the Department of Quiet, Catastrophes, or you can simply let your eyelids volunteer for a gentle union break. Either way, the ribbon will go on relaxing at its own courteous pace. The watchers who had expected crashing and tearing find themselves observing technicalities. A length of dwarven silk, the one said to contain the noise a fox makes when it runs on snow, gives way by misplacing the fox's left paw. Another strand unspools the root of a mountain, which turns out to be a very short piece when you measure it with patience. None of this is loud. It's administrative. Ravens tilt their heads, impressed by the paperwork. Somewhere a shepherd tucks his flock into a fold of land that has always acted more like a pocket, and he notes, with the diligence of a man who has known 4 winters lined up end to end, that the air tastes like cold bread. The wolf opens his jaw just enough to make room for a first deliberate breath, and as he exhales, a small cloud forms that looks exactly like a house with the lights still on. He doesn't bark. He has nothing to announce. He has always known the date. Word spreads with the gravity of a calendar reminder, not panic. Just the kind of hush that arrives when you realize the recipe has reached the part where it says, "Now let it happen." The horn to be blown is lifted by a set of hands that recently buttered bread. Its player looks for one very human second, like a person wondering if the neighbors will mind the volume, and then remembers this is the purpose of neighbors. The note that comes is deep and well-seasoned. It is practiced in fjords and under snow roofs, and in the round bellies of drinking holes. Birds turn to face north the way polite guests turn toward a toast. The sea, hearing its cue, folds a sleeve and exposes a new current it's been saving. Ships built from practical and impolite materials edge out from shadows. Their nails have the color of old tea. They look pleased to be understood at last. The ground does a useful thing. It tightens its grip on things that want to stay and loosens under feet that need to run. Pine roots flex like experienced fingers. Stones put their round shoulders to the work of bearing weight. Vidar, who has never made a speech and is not about to start, checks the fit of his quiet shoe. It is thick, and not only from the leather of 1,000 offcuts, though that would be reason enough to trust it. It is thick with errands. Every cobbler's sweepings, every little comma of hide that was almost nothing says, "We are here," which is a good sentence for a shoe to make. He doesn't tug the laces. He lets them settle. Someone later will call what he does vengeance, but just at this dull-lit hour, he is simply doing quality control. While the sky finds its matches and sets them neatly on the mantle, Odin steps into a thought he has been rehearsing for longer than ravens remember. If destiny is a door, he has already held the handle. He does not tighten his grip on the spear because it has never objected to being held loosely. He does tighten his memory around small items, the exact weight of a winter cloud before it chooses to snow, the feel of a wooden threshold under a barefoot heel at dawn. The way Frigg's quiet becomes warm when she is thinking about something she knows she will not say. He looks across the plain that has introduced itself all his life as later, and notices, because he is the kind of person who always notices, that the grass is standing very straight, as if every blade had been told it might be measured. The wolf is in motion that hardly disturbs his outline, like a hill deciding to try being a hill somewhere else. His paws do not crash. They fold and unfold the way good blankets do. When he yawns, it is less a display than a stretch, and when the jaw closes again, a line of saliva draws. A thread between teeth that would be an excellent harp string if you could play Fate without plucking your own sleeve. He is not angry. He is punctual. He has, in his own Lupin way, our SVPD. Every prophecy that ever wrote his name politely gets a small check mark next to it. There's comfort in paperwork. You might imagine the sun screaming. You would be wrong. It steps down from its hook in the sky with the grace of a well-briefed actor. A wolf who is more idea than animal takes it into his mouth, as if keeping it in a very serious lost and found box. The light folds, as light does when asked nicely, and the world practices being lit by memory rather than flame. For a moment, the color of everything shifts toward the shade of parchment rubbed by thumb and forefinger. People look better in that color. It's very flattering. Somewhere a cook continues to stir a pot because hunger has no interest in dramaturgy. The moon, seeing the sun's practical decision, enters the same arrangement and is kept likewise. The sky looks not empty but simplified, like a shelf you've decided will hold only the important mugs. Now the plane is busy without hurry. Spears tilt as if listening to a coach. Shields make that accepted sound again, the one they make when struck by something expected. The earth is soft in the exact places the prophecies penciled long ago. Odin walks toward the wolf in tempo with his thoughts slow, square, good for marching or milling grain, and the wolf comes on with the posture of a task assigned to someone who enjoys competency. When they arrive at each other, it is almost cozy. The jaws that open could be mistaken for a doorway, and there is hospitality in them, old as caves. Odin steps in the way and Apple steps into a pocket. It is one of the most courteous swallowings in literature. Inside a mouth that could be called a hall, many things that are not words nevertheless speak very clearly. The breath is not hot. It is regular, like a tide that dreamt it was a metronome. The tongue is not rough, it is factual. Odin sets his spear down in the only open corner good. Guests do not clutter, and he considers, briefly, how much a god weighs when he is no longer asked to weigh everything. If there were time, he might compose a line about this. There is not time. But the thought sits somewhere that thoughts are kept and will be found by someone who needs it. Outside, where time still puts on a show, Vidar closes the distance with that thick-shoed step you might use when testing a floorboard. He is not performing heroics. He is doing maintenance. The shoe, being exactly itself, remembers every cobbler who shook his broom into a sack, and every apprentice who asked if that was enough and was told a little more. When Vidar places his foot as instructed here, the ledger had said, in neat script something of great size stops being entirely in one place. This too is not loud. Wood creaks. Air leaves a small space in an orderly evacuation. The wolf's jaw opens in the same surprised respect a door shows when faced with a screwdriver wielded by someone who has read the manual. But let's drift for a moment, as the day itself seems to the edges where the bookkeeping is especially pleasant. At the shoreline, a woman ties her hair with a strip of linen because it is windy and because she wants to see properly the ships that are moving as if pulled by sentences. She is not afraid of them. They are well built, even if you would not want to ask too many questions about the lumber, and they ride a sea that has become efficient. Fish have opinions about all this. They express them by changing depth. Ravens supervise. A boy wonders whether his boots will remember his feet if feet become less relevant. and then decides they will. Far inland, a bowl of milk thickens just enough to remind everyone that life likes to proceed. It is not disrespectful to the end of the world to notice breakfast. The fire that has been promised arrives without vanity. It knows exactly where it's going, the way good soup knows which bowls are clean. Surt holds his sword in a grip you might use on a well-sharpened knife while slicing bread thin enough for company. Across the plain, other matters finish being started. A serpent, who has opinions about spiral geometry, practices exhaling. A bridge, trained for years in the art of collapse, performs its one trick with the grace of a bow after a song. But we stay, because the project at hand belongs to leather, and the old idea that pressure, correctly applied, is a kind of kindness. The Dar's foot levers, the upper jaw invites daylight. The lower meets a steady hand. This is all very simple in the way bricklaying is simple. If you lean very close to this moment, not enough to wake yourself, just near enough for a soft focus, you can hear the quiet click in the world's lock as a key turns with no resistance. The wolf makes a noise that is not a growl and not a sigh. The closest name for it would be release. Odin steps back into the air, which, relieved of its duties as interior decor, covers him the way a well-fitting shirt covers a shoulder. He does not gloat. He is not the sword. He gathers himself up like a folded cloak. He knows there are immoral lines in the ledger, and that his job is not to insist on them, but to read them in order. Somewhere he thinks, without making a sound of it, the shoemaker's. The sky holds its breath, which is an impressive trick for something that is mostly breath. Then it lets the breath out, and the letting out is what we call wind. It shuffles ash like a card dealer who enjoys tidiness. The plain is now a room in which many small duties continue. A shield finds its owner, or an owner finds a reason to set the shield down. Both are successes. A spear stands upright in new ground because it likes the view. Two figures who have never exchanged words and will never do, so share the nod that passes between people who took different roads to the same appointment and arrived on time. High above, where colors thin, something lets go of every preference and becomes a color called after. It's a good color for napping. What of endings? In the north, they behave like well-swept floors, ready for any kind of furniture. There is talk in some corners. Corners always love to talk of halls that will be rebuilt with such attention to detail that even the doors will recognize the hands that push them open. Someone mentions that the grass will grow again, but shrugs, as if to say that grass has always been good at that and needs no applause. It is said that a pair of humans will wake up in a world that has been gently set back on its feet, and that they will find berries already thoughtful about being picked. This is not a twist, it is housekeeping. The ledger anticipated it 2 pages ago. If you are still following the thread, you might feel like a drowsy guest at a very orderly conclusion meeting, where everyone takes minutes and no one raises their voice. The minutes record that chains were broken without scandal. That a shoe did its one job brilliantly. That a wolf, who had been asked to keep something, kept it and then let it go. That a god took his place in a story with the good manners of a reader returning a book on time. The minutes also note that fires behave like fires, seas like seas, and people like people, some brave, some hungry, some curious about whether the spoons would need polishing later. They would. Spoons always do. Night, in the form of smoke and quiet, comes to double-check the arithmetic. It looks over the sums, not with suspicion, just with interest, and approves the carryovers. Ash settles on fields in a way farmers understand. The air cools carefully, remembering the shoulders it is about to touch. Dogs, who do not read ledgers and do not care for prophecy unless it is thrown for them, curl into their favorite commas. The ravens finally take a break and roost in the kind of silence that wears a sweater of crickets. Above them, the sky becomes very blank and very kind, like a fresh page offered to tired hands. And somewhere on that page, a new line waits politely to be written. It will not hurry anyone. It will not spoil your sleep if you choose to take it now. The old shoe will be set to dry by a door. The ribbon, having fulfilled its career, will daydream itself into grass. The ledger will stay open to breathe, as books like to do when the room is good and still. If your eyes close, no one will mind. The world, even in its last tidy labors, has the soft-hearted habit of dimming its own lights for those who need the dark. The first warnings of the end did not arrive with lightning or drums. They came as a song traded quietly across a fire, a voice like wool being pulled into yarn, telling a king what he already suspected. The singer was a woman who remembered before memory, the vulva who speaks in the poem people later called the Veluspa, and she did not rush. She watched smoke put its paragraphs into the rafters and said that one day the great ash would tremble, and a certain chain would decide it had been patient enough. She did not shout the wolf's name. She didn't need to. Names in the north travel on their own feet. Odin listened with the posture of someone holding a cup he does not intend to drink from. He had paid for this knowledge with a curious sort of currency gifts traded. Questions stacked like kindling, and the room became a bench where time sat politely. This is how prophecies begin in these stories, not with spectacle, but with a person who knows the difference between silence and the start of a sentence. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you may follow the rest of the sentences with us, or if sleep offers you a chair by the window, you can let this tale go on in the background like a kettle that never quite boils. I will not take attendance. The seeress spoke of 3 winters braided into one, a braided cord called Fimble Winter, which is fun to say if you whisper it, and easier to imagine if you think of every corner of the world agreeing to keep the cold. A little longer than necessary. In her words, the sun behaved like a candle that had decided to take a day off, and the moon like a friend who goes along with the plan because it is too late to reschedule. She mentioned roosters, 3 of them, each with a color assignment, 1 golden in the halls above, 1 red under the roots, 1 a shade you could call rust if you were painting a shed, and this detail always delights me because it suggests it. The universe posts reminders across departments. She noted that wolves would chase those lights and would not tire, since the work schedule for cosmic wolves is famously well organized. There would be a horn, she added, not for panic, but for clarity, because big days appreciate clear audio. Heimdall would play it, and he has always understood volume control. A ship would come loose from its unusual dock, a ship assembled from the nails of the dead, a fact that reads like a footnote from a rather stern household manual. Please trim your nails. It may affect maritime traffic, Odin asked as he tends. 2 about the future with the soft persistence of a person adjusting a picture frame. He keeps collections, does Odin, runes, loose ends, rumors gathered from ravens, very old receipts. The seeress, whose mouth had the cadence of snowmelt over stones, told him about the wolf bound with a ribbon that felt like a riddle. She said the wolf would test it at the correct time and find the knot had remembered young dreams. The dwarves would not be consulted. They would be busy with their own schedules, checking the temper on swords and the angles on hinges. The tree, the great one, the one that has a bird for an opinion and a dragon for a complaint, would shiver up and down its bark, which is the tree version of muttering, "Well then." The lands would move slightly to make room for whatever needed room. The dead would not so much rise as organize, and this is important, because chaos is simply the part of order that has not been alphabetized yet. She said all this in that particular voice elders use when telling a child how to find the good oven mitts. The future can be large, but the telling of it is domestic. The wolf's involvement appeared in her list the way a spoon appears when you set the table. It belongs to the place setting and is not in dispute. Somewhere in the telling, she reminded him that every promise that glitters does so because somebody polished it. Tyr's hand, the shoe scraps that would one day become a certain son's thick sole, the odd ingredients that went into the ribbon cats, footsteps, fish's breath, bird spit, and so on. These were not trivia. They were the labels on drawers. When the time came, the hands that knew those drawers would reach in without looking. Prophecy is a storage system with good memory. What makes this particular set of prophecies so comfortable for bedtime, if we can say such a thing, is how little surprise it pretends to offer. The wolf will do what wolves do when schedules and patients agree. The gods will do what officials do when calendars grow interesting. Giants will be themselves with renewed confidence. Even the sea seems pleased to flex. And all the while, the seeress does not sharpen her voice. She leaves room for nodding. She mentions that the mead goat on the roof of Valhalla will continue to provide beverages until the very last call, which is generous, and that the Einherjar have trained for centuries in a way that looks like an extremely committed exercise. Class. Runes will behave like very experienced traffic signs. Some people will ask for instructions. Others will find that their feet know already which way the dust will lean. Some listeners imagine that prophecy creates the future the way chalk draws a road. The old poem suggests something less bossy. The vulva is not building a path. She is pointing out that moss grows more thickly on the side you end up walking anyway. To prove her point, she interviews small omens. She tells how an old woman somewhere in a coastal house knit a mitten with 8 perfect mistakes in it and felt inexplicably satisfied. She tells how a shepherd on a gray morning counted his sheep twice and arrived at the same number both times, a number that later turns out to be the number of oars on a ship that has no right to float. She remarks that on a spring day, a raven dropped a nutshell into a grove and that the tree, out of courtesy, adjusted a branch to catch it. These are the kind of notes the universe leaves for itself. The wolf reads them without moving his lips. There is a detail often skipped because it is not flashy. The vulva describes how the bonds that hold the world in its useful shape are not iron bars but habits, and how habits are broken by the same method you use on new shoes. Wear them a little every day. She says that under the lake, where the ribbon lies wrapped like an old gift around a young problem, the water learns the shape of patience so thoroughly that patience becomes the shape of water. When at last the day arrives, it will not feel like a red button pressed in a sudden room. It will feel like a door completing a long, quiet swing. The best locks open exactly as they were designed to do. This is why the wolf is not a villain. In her mouth, he is a function. He is the sentence reaching its period. By now you might be somewhere between awake and the kind of drowsy in which you understand everything said to you and could repeat none of it. That is a good place to hear that even the numbers in the story prefer calm. 9 worlds. 3 roots. 1 ash. We could count farther into the various halls and the names of the roosters and the colors of the dwarves' hats, but the math does not change its mind. When Heimdall puts the horn to his lips, he does not do so to frighten anyone. He does it because sound keeps good records. The note will inform cliffs and shorelines and breakfast tables with equal courtesy. It will find wolf ears in god ears, and those ears belong to mortals who will glance up from their tasks and say, "Ah, right," as if the weather report had. Match the sky, if you like small facts, and many sleepers do. There's an aside about the ship Naglfar that is quietly comic. It is said to be made of the nails of the dead, which is a statement that makes more sense when you recall how well Scandinavians manage waste. The cautionary moral is simple. Keep nails trimmed, not because a boat will otherwise launch prematurely, but because good grooming is a kind of civic cooperation. Across graveyards, caretakers add clippings to the tiniest fires and feel a public-spirited glow. In a world where prophecies are audited, even cuticles might file reports. These modest rituals of care mean that when the ship does launch, it does so exactly on time. Even doom appreciates a timetable kept tidy. Another pleasant corner of the prophecy is the attention it gives to materials. Fire is assigned to the one who carries a sword that is its own sunrise. Water is given to a serpent who already understands circles better than most schools. Earth belongs to those who spent their lives learning how rocks want to be stacked. Air remains in the care of birds who know at what height news tastes best. And the wolf, he is matched with breath, that is all. His presence is a study in inhaling and exhaling. First he learns how air goes around a ribbon. Then he learns how it goes around a plane. Eventually he learns how it sounds inside a full set of teeth. When the end arrives, there will be a moment that is only breath, and the seeress smiles when she mentions it, as if letting the listener in on a household trick for keeping bread soft. You may think this is all rather polite for an apocalypse. The poem thinks so too. Its manners are deliberate. The vulva names what will break not to dramatize it, but to make sure everyone knows where the broom is kept. Odin asks about the part with himself in it, and she tells him with the tone of a friend reminding you which cupboard holds the mugs. Yes. The wolf, yes. Your road ends like a sentence that has been patiently waiting for its verb. He nods. Gods, who trade eyes for a sip, have already agreed to be corrected by large truths. The wise thing about prophecy is that it reduces the number of surprises to a manageable few. When you have only a few surprises, you can fold them like sweaters. The rumor in the poem, the rumor that belongs to the wolf, is that his breaking free is not outrage but alignment. Gleipnir loosens, yes, but on a schedule assigned by every ingredient. The cat footstep clocks in. The fish breath submits its timesheet. The bird spit initials the margin. The mountain root, a quiet administrator, stamps the form. Somewhere a dwarf says approved into a bearded telephone no one else can hear. When the ribbon at last decides to be something else, the wolf does not leap. He rises the way a thought rises from the back of your mind and moves to the front. If we are still counting microhooks, here's one more. Some say the chain left a faint taste in his fur, like mint you can't quite place. No one minds. It's tidy. I like the way the poem remembers the small staff who will be on duty. The Norns do not stop to explain their knots. They have threads to file. The ravens keep their minutes in the margins where remarks like, as expected, fill the page. The dwarves run their hands over their favorite ambles because it is habit, and habit brings comfort even to those who set habits in motion for others. People sometimes imagine Ragnar as a surprise party for chaos, but it is more like inventory measured with care. The wolf's part is printed on every list. He is not late. He is not early. He is the exact arrival time of a train you can hear well before you see it. A long, low note rounding a curve, you have already decided to stand back from dot near the end of the telling. As the fire thins to a map of red islands and dark sand, the seeress adds a postscript. After the smoke, after the neat accounting, there will be a field that looks like the pause after a good answer. 2 figures will walk there, and berries always volunteer will be available. A hall brighter than old stories will be built in a place that had been keeping square footage quiet in its pocket. The wolf will no longer feature in the minutes. He will have done his section of the agenda and stepped out. Things will be simpler for a while. Simpler is not dull. It's just easier to dust. And this is how the prophecies of the North treat the breaking of the chain and the work of the wolf. Not as a scream, but as a calendar page turning in a book bound in thick leather. The pages smell faintly of smoke and pine sap, and the kind of mead that insists on being described as honest. If your eyes are heavy now, you have chosen an excellent time to set the book on your chest and let it make a small shelter out of its covers. The vulva has finished speaking. Odin has filed the report. The horn is on its peg. Somewhere a shoemaker is sweeping a floor with a satisfaction that will make sense to his children. And the wolf, in the place where long plans wait their turn, breathes in and breathes out, neither hurried nor slow. Exactly the speed at which sleep finds you and keeps you, which is to say, the speed of everything that knows its part and performs it without needing to be asked again. People sometimes imagine that wolves decide what to hunt, but in the north there is a tidier custom. Sometimes a mule chooses its wolf. The story of the one who will end Odin is told like this, with more filing than roaring, as though fate runs. A long counter with drawers labeled in quiet handwriting. Long before anyone thought to oil a hinge or tighten a strap, the vulva said there would be a match, not a fight, the way a key eventually meets the lock it was cut for. She did not shout the names. Names in these stories walk in by themselves and hang up their own cloaks. Still, you can recognize the pair by their habits. Odin keeps information as if it were laundry to be folded, forever smoothing the same shirt. He sends ravens for rumors and brings them back as notes pinned to his sleeve. He keeps 2 house wolves, Jerry and Fricky, and shares meat with them because he prefers to live on drink and questions. If you picture him at a table, he is the one who eats with his mind and stirs the air with a spear that never misplaces its point. The other is Fenrir, and if the word destined sounds dramatic, you can soften it until it feels like the word scheduled. There were reports, then drafts of the reports, and eventually a final version stamped by hands that do not tremble. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to hear the rest of the paperwork, or let sleep sign for you. I will assume the signature is legible either way. People often ask why the Allfather, who stacks plans like kindling and has a well-known fondness for contingency, did not simply cancel the appointment. This is answered best with small details, the way a good recipe tells you how the spoon should feel against the bowl. The Norns, 3 at the root where water learns memory, are not judges. They are accountants of thread. They do not argue with you. They show you your own handwriting. When Odin leaned down for the first sip at Mimir's well and arranged his face to have one less eye, he was not bargaining so much as declaring he would read the minutes, even when they were written in the dark. The minutes included a note. A wolf, raised almost like a child among the gods until feeding him required a team and a silence, would one day be the place where Odin's road stops to tie its last knot. This is not the only prophecy attached to the family. Fenrir's brother is the serpent who measures oceans with his waistline, which is an efficient if immodest method, and his sister keeps a house for those who need a quiet room for a long time. You see the pattern. Loki's children are like punctuation, comma, parenthesis, full stop, and it is considered impolite to dislike punctuation merely because it knows when to end a sentence. Odin tried the available courtesies anyway. He weighed possible leashes, rehearsed speeches about honor, even organized a remarkably civil council meeting where the chairs were arranged so no one felt trapped. But prophecy is like a path whose dust has chosen your feet. You can walk anywhere you like and still come home with that dust. When the dwarves delivered a ribbon that behaved like a riddle cat's footfall, fish's breath, bird's spit, mountain roots, woman's beard, the noises missing from a quiet house, everyone complimented the craftsmanship, and the wolf smiled without his eyes. Tyr gave a hand to make the promise look confident. The Norns penciled an asterisk in the margin and went on with their day. Odin, being industrious in the way that looks like patience from a distance, prepared as a farmer prepares for a weather pattern he cannot vote on. He collected the best fallen, polished them with training in Valhalla until their reflexes were bright. He kept his spear Gungnir obedient and asked the runes to stand up in neat rows whenever he called attendance. He met with his son Vidar, the quiet one whose shoe sole is famously thick because it is stitched from the odd trimmings of every cobbler's bench. And they discuss footwork in the way some families discuss hedge maintenance, pleasant, practical, oddly calming. He listened to Heimdall practicing scales on the horn in the morning so that no one would be surprised by the volume later. He checked the raven's flight plans. He walked under the ash and touched the bark as if it were the railing on a staircase he has counted for years. None of this was panic. It was home economics. He knew a wolf's mouth would one day be the only room left to enter, and he intended to arrive having finished his correspondence. In an amusing fragment from a skald's notebook, there is even a list of kennings for Odin prepared for the occasion: father of hosts, wearer of many names, borrower of light, customer at deep wells, like name tags for a complicated reunion. For Fenrir, there were fewer nicknames. Wolves require less introduction. He grew as beings do when opinion is withheld, steadily without the burden of performance. The chain held because that was its job, just as his ribs held because that was theirs. On clear nights, he learned the courtesy of not frightening the horses. On overcast ones, he practiced ignoring footsteps. Destiny's strength is that it does not need rehearsal. Nevertheless, he rehearsed. It is oddly comforting that the North does not accuse anyone of villainy here. The idea that Odin and the wolf are adversaries the way snow is the enemy of mittens is mostly a modern impulse. The poems prefer a simpler geometry. Odin is the line that reaches. Fenrir is the line that ends it. You can dislike the ending and still praise the handwriting. Skalds, who love neat metaphors the way geese love tidy V-shaped travel, call Odin battle's poet and Fenrir boundary's appetite, which sounds fierce and tastes mild when spoken slowly. One can trace the mildness through small household facts. In the kitchens of Asgard, there is a jar on the shelf labeled Vidar scraps, where leather offcuts accumulate with the same quiet determination that makes glaciers persuasive. On a hook by the door, a horn waits, polished lately by someone who likes circles. Near a window, a pair of ravens preen each other because partnership is not only a field tactic but also good grooming. In the storeroom, a ribbon hangs, slack as, a sigh looking lighter than it weighs. And somewhere a wolf breathes, counting by twos because paws find it restful. The ravens fly across the thought of his future and drop facts like crumbs. They say his destiny is not hunger but completion. They say Odin will meet him with the courtesy of someone returning a borrowed book. They say the sky will widen at exactly the right moment, the way a sleeve adjusts when you set down a heavy bowl. If that sounds too efficient for an ending, you are welcome to fall asleep and revisit it later. Endings are forgiving. They do not mind being reread. People who collect trivia, the true hobby of the drowsy, will be pleased to know that there are, scattered through the old verses, many tiny markers pointing toward the meeting the way lighthouses point without fuss. One says the wolf's saliva will make a river. Another says his breath will change the flavor of the air from ordinary day to last morning without anyone feeling rushed. A curious note explains that Odin's ravens will not fly far that day because even messengers prefer to be home when the calendar page turns. There is a suggestion that a particular stone, smooth as the palm that once rubbed it, will remember where to lie down after the ground jogs sideways. And of course there is the bureaucratic comfort that every great event in this mythology arrives when most things are already finished, the way a store closes after the last customer has found her change. Odin's lists will be short by then. He will have asked every question he could afford and paid for the answers with the exact change of himself. Fenrir's lists will be even shorter. He has one item and the ink does not smudge. Some think the gods would have escaped the appointment if they had used different stationery. But the poems smile at that and point back to the Norse ledger, where the handwriting is old and the lines are ruled very straight, the destiny is not a trap. It is just the neatest fold the fabric can make. And if you're drifting now, picture the fold as a lap in which the wolf rests his head for a moment before the page goes on to whatever page it becomes next. This is the gentlest way to think of it, and gentleness suits the hour. You might not expect a wolf to begin like a household errand, but Fenrir's arrival reads very much like one more line on the gods' running list. Milk the goats, count the shields, find a place for Loki's newest child. He was brought from the iron forests, where pine needles sound like rain even on clear days, and where Angrboda kept a careful, almost comb-like order to her brood. The pup was small at first, small enough to nap in Tyr's shadow, small enough that even Heimdall, who notices when a cloud chooses a different edge, did not sound the alarm. But pups do the one thing even prophecies cannot hurry. They grow by the spoonful. His paws enlarged the way bread swells under a warm cloth, quiet and inevitable, and the kitchen staff in Asgard began keeping a second trough near the door. 4. The house wolf, as if labeling it could make it ordinary. Someone found it charming, the way he would tuck his nose into his tail to sleep, like a piece of punctuation curling around the line of a sentence. If you remain awake in a little while, you can subscribe to hear how a comma becomes an exclamation point. If you drift off, we will simply keep reading to the blankets. The gods were kind at first because kindness is a habit in well-run halls. They gave Fenrir the leftover bones from Odin's ceremonial meals, and the pup learned the soft etiquette of waiting by the post rather than under the table. He was not allowed inside the council chamber, but he dozed in the sun outside with his ear laid against the threshold, catching the hum of voices as though the floor itself were a beehive. A stable boy was assigned to brush him with a rake-sized comb. Another was assigned, eventually, to brush the first boy's sleeves where the hair clung like weather. Odin, who liked to collect information the way others collect walking sticks, would sometimes stand at the gate with his single bright eye, measuring the wolf in that calm way accountants measure columns. The measurements traveled to the minds of everyone who saw him. When a pup's yawn can be mistaken for a doorway, people begin to think about reinforcement. The mead hall talked in whispers that sounded suspiciously like arithmetic. If this today, then that tomorrow, and someday a set of jaws that makes even a spear think of retirement. No one panicked. They just drafted, revised, and redrafted their silences into precautions. Fear in Asgard has a tidy look, like bed linens folded to the same width. The first fold was to feed him elsewhere, so that the clatter of plotters would not teach his hunger to expect trumpets. The next fold was to ask Tyr to watch him, because Tyr had a talent for steady gestures. The god of oaths understood how to offer a hand like a bridge, and a bridge is a thing even a river respects. Fenrir respected bridges, but preferred open fields. He learned the circumference of his tether the way a scholar learns the edge of a page, and then he learned to sit at that edge with a patience that made the ravens hop a little farther away on the fence. When the Norns were asked politely, because it is useless to be rude to time, what should be done, they pushed the loom, made that low, rhythmic sound a loom makes when it agrees with itself, and pointed, without looking, toward the dwarves. Forges. There are words that mean solution and words that mean compromise. And then there are words that mean we will need a very good ribbon. The dwarves, being experts in unlikely knickknacks and items that feel heavier than they weigh, took the commission the way a baker takes a cake order with too many layers, with relish and a second pencil. They collected the sound of a cat's footstep, which looks surprisingly like a smudge of frost when it is held up to the light. They captured a fish's breath in a glass jar, which must be opened underwater if you want to keep the taste fresh. Bird spittle was easier. Birds are optimists and will spit about anything if you ask nicely and offer a dish of seeds. From under a mountain, they coaxed out roots, the way a patient barber coaxes a tangle. And they snipped a woman's beard, which exists chiefly as a rumor, but, like rumors, can be braided if you know the right corners of the world. Bear sinew contributed its quiet thread of strength, because bears are generous in winter when their calendars are open. All this was spun into Gleipnir, thin as a thought, slick as a yes. It felt like silk and behaved like arithmetic dot, the day the ribbon was tested has been sung with too much drum and not enough paperwork. Imagine instead a very long appointment over tea. Fenrir arrived because he had been invited, and he respected invitations almost as much as he respected fresh snow. The gods complimented the ribbon as if it were a guest. So light, they said, and surely the strongest thing is often the least boastful. The Wolf considered this like a student considers a riddle. He said he would participate if someone placed a mouth tax in his keeping, something valuable, something living to prove their goodwill. Tyr's hand, which had always behaved, was volunteered, not with bravery, but with the calm of someone leaving a deposit against accidental damages. The ribbon slipped on the wolf as easily as evening slips on a field. It tightened the way dusk tightens evenly. When Fenrir pushed against it, there was no sound, and perhaps the quiet was what he disliked most. Promises prefer noises. The hand, suddenly without its wrist, went home with the wolf the way a bookmark goes home with a book. Tyr, who had always kept his word, revised it thereafter with one palm. The god said the proper formal things about sacrifices. The dwarves received their fee, and Fenrir was moved to a place with fewer paths for wandering. Prophecies thrive. On light housekeeping, they did not have to be dramatic if someone dusted them. Odin, who liked to dust, visited the vulva when he needed the gentle firmness of a schedule. She had that look of a person whose tea is always the exact right temperature. She told him the dates without numbers, after the chickens have forgotten the fox, after the ice remembers how to float again, after the serpent finishes measuring the sea by wrapping it up like a bolt of cloth. She mentioned, with the politeness of a librarian, that his name and Fenrir's would share a page, not as enemies, but as neighbors in the index under necessary. Odin nodded as though accepting a well-stitched coat, and he returned to the hall to put more attention on what he already paid attention to, runes lined up like schoolchildren. Shields mended as though they were favorite stories. The training yards, where the chosen dead learn to turn roaring into choreography. It is soothing to watch people prepare. Even the ravens found it comforting. They practiced circling at a respectful distance from Gleipnir, like a pair of commas keeping a secret clause. There are tiny details in the old verses that seldom make the grand retellings, and they are the true lullabies of the tale. The river called Van is said to owe some of its shape to Fenrir's ongoing commentary about the unfairness of chords. Even the sternest chain will coax a little foam from a mouth if the mouth has opinions. Vidar's shoe grows all that time, from offcuts gathered by cobblers who do not like waste. If you look at it sideways, you can see patches and shades of almost brown, which is a pleasing color for a thing that intends to be quiet. On a shelf above Odin's seat, there is a small wooden box where he keeps favor tokens, like bits of antler and a particular pebble. Reminders that stories will ask for repayment in their own currency. The box makes a gentle scraping sound when opened, the kind of sound that makes one think of winter fires still sleeping in the woodpile, and there's no fear in it at all. When someone says that a wolf will kill a god, the sentence can feel like thunder. When one notices that the god has been packing a lunch for that date for a century, it becomes something else, a picnic planned for the end of a map. Ragnarok is described in loud rooms like a storm. In quieter corners, it sounds more like the day the furniture is rearranged. Gleipnir, having done a thorough job, eventually agrees to be done. The ribbon does not so much snap a sigh and decide to be a belt somewhere else. Fenrir stands, not with rage, but with the interest of a person stretching after a long ride. He steps into the wider field like a walker testing new shoes. The sky has already set its table with fire and frost because that is its ritual for big discussions. And everyone arrives in their chosen uniforms, some in mail, some in memory, some in the soft clothes of last duties. Odin meets the wolf not as a trap meets a foot, but as a final period meets a sentence that has found its whole shape. The spear he carries is straight as always. Straightness does not abandon its habits at the last. The ravens do not fly far that day. They prefer familiar perches when the clock face changes. They keep the hall company, landing on the rafters as if they were folding chairs waiting for the next meeting. Of course, there is an ending. Of course, it remembers to be spare. The mouth that learned patience opens, and a god who has loved questions. More than food finds the answer that never needed debating. Skalds, who adore a flourish, often reach for drumbeats here, but the poems themselves are gentler. They say the world breathes out. They say a shoe, thicker than any shoe, has a right to be steps where it was always meant to step, because even endings are shared work. They say the sea uncoils its belt and straightens its shirt. They say trees learn a new word for standing. If this seems grand, remember the broom leaning against the wall. Remember the box of trimmings. Remember the way Tyr changed how he waved to people and made it the new normal. The last things are done with that same housekeeping grace. And when people later said the wolf devoured the gods, the stories did not list it as a crime. They listed it as the alphabet's last letter being used properly. Fenrir, who had been a guest and then a riddle, ended by being a door. Odin, who had been a wanderer and then a collector, ended by being a key turned all the way. Afterward, there is ash in the air, but it floats like dust in a shaft of window light, which is to say, beautifully if you are calm. Somewhere a child on a far farm ties a new ribbon around a new box, because even in stories where flames decorate the margins, people still have things to store. Somewhere a cat walks and no one hears it, and the dwarves smile at their old joke. Somewhere, even now, a large paw lies heavy in sleep, and the earth does what it has always done for sleepers. It holds still. So the dream can stay level dot by the time someone retells it all out loud. The corners soften in the mouth. We remember that fear was folded properly before it was put away, that promises were treated like tools, that the biggest events are often the ones with the fewest verbs. We remember that an impossible chain felt like silk, that a god's best. Preparation looked like lists and tiding, that a wolf learned not to chase horses because he had time. If you have followed the thread to here, it has been mostly a thread of chores feedings, scheduled, shoemakers cutting, ravens filing their own reports, looms murmuring. And if, while hearing all this, your eyes heavy themselves and your breath begins to keep count like pause, that is fine too. The North approves of rest. Behind every prophecy a chair waits, sturdy and plain, so someone can sit and take it in without rushing. We could continue with more tiny facts, the names of the cobblers who contributed, the exact shape of the jar that held the fish's breath, the number of times the ravens practiced not interrupting a meeting, but perhaps it is better to let the room dim, let the ribbon loosen its memory of itself, and let the story keep breathing in that broad wolfish way until even the gods are part of the quiet they made. You might expect the end of the world to arrive like a storm front, but in the old stories it comes on the quiet feet of errands, as if someone put unmake the sky between sharpen the spear and check the goat locks. Odin's. Fall sits there on the list, calm and centered, next to chores that look suspiciously routine. The day is cool in the kind of way that makes wood creak, as if it were thinking things over. Even the ravens sound careful, hopping from beam to beam. like punctuation marks that have learned to whisper. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you can follow this entire to-do list with me. There's a box to tick beside each item, very satisfying, or if sleep smudges the ink a little, that's fine too. Someone will keep the ledger. The North is good at ledgers. Odin likes ledgers, and he keeps one in his mind. Each page measured against the runes he carved on himself the way a book carves on a shelf. He has spent lifetimes preparing for a meeting with the wolf, and when a meeting is that old, it does not feel like a fight. It feels like a time slot. He wears the same cloak he wears on wet market mornings, and Gungnir looks, as always, like an idea that learned to stand up straight. With all the noise people predict for Ragnarok, the detail that goes missing is how many things proceed with the familiar decorum. The stable doors are latched in the usual way. The cooks set bread too. Rise because bread is stubborn about its schedule. Somebody moves the salt horn a little closer to the fire, the way you do when you're not thinking about it, but your hand remembers heat and habit. Far out beyond the walls, the wolf is also keeping an appointment, and if he could write, he would sign his name with a line that keeps going. There are omens, yes, but many are small enough to fold into a pocket. A frost pattern on a shield that looks like a map to somewhere no one intends to visit. A spring that tastes like copper for only an hour. A shepherd noticing that the flock stands all with their noses in the same direction, as if someone told them a story and they lean toward the next sentence. The Norns do not issue a bulletin. They simply let the cloth draw a little tighter on the loom, and that is signal enough for anyone who knows what cloth is supposed to feel like. Even the dwarves pause in their forges to oil a hinge that has developed a squeak. One does not want squeaks on a day when everything else is supposed to run like a well-remembered memory. There is a sense not of doom, but of tiding. When a world intends to close a chapter, it dusts the margins, and someone always goes around straightening the benches. Fenrir's breath lifts in the cold, like a thread of smoke that forgot where the fire ended. His fur has the color of iron that has been handled so much it has become friendly. He has learned, over years of watching doors open in the distance, that patience is the best way to look large without trying. The river by him, which has been collecting the foam of his commentary for ages, makes its usual argument with the stones. The famous ribbon is not famous anymore. Gleipnir has lost its taste for names and lies there like a memory of silk. When chains are ready to retire, they simply choose to be something else, perhaps a rumor in a tailor's shop, perhaps the feeling a hat has of being held on by the wind. The wolf understands this without bothering to understand it. He yawns in that slow, careful way big animals yawn, with respect for the horizon. Somewhere, a cat places one foot with such expertise that even prophecy cannot hear it. Inside the great hall, Odin eats a little, not because he must, but because the habit of breaking bread obviously belongs in the morning. He does the small domestic things that make a day feel owned, like moving a candle one thumb width, so the pool of wax can find its center, and tightening the strap that keeps a bundle of letters from sighing open. He consults no counsel. He is himself a council of one, and he approves the minutes of the previous meeting. There is a small wooden box on the shelf above him where he keeps small oddities, an antler tip, a rare seed, a rune carved by an apprentice that looks like a shy fish. He looks at the box, not to take anything, but to let the box know it is remembered. If you're still listening, you might appreciate that the gods, for all their pageantry, believe in this kind of checking. Where's the box? Does it still have its hinge? Did we thank the person who made it? If you've wandered off toward sleep, the hinge will hold for a later dot. The field where they meet is an ordinary piece of ground, the kind that has patiently stored sunlight in its rocks for colder seasons, and now, like a considerate host, returns. The warmth in small installments, There are the expected witnesses, the spear, the shoe that has been gathering offcuts the way slow rivers gather islands, the ravens, and the horizon that doesn't intend to get involved but can't help being. Present, Vidar stands with his quiet shoe, which is not a single thing so much as a census of leather. Cobblers have been sending trimmings for centuries with the same pride you feel when your contribution to a quilt is a single square that ends up near the middle. People imagine the shoe as a weapon. Really, it is a list of names sewn together, the way communities often are. If it creaks a little, the creak sounds like a long-cancelled debt. When Odin looks at Fenrir, he looks with that one bright eye that has always behaved like an open window. And what he sees is not a monster, but a sentence that needs its final punctuation. The wolf looks back and sees not prey, nor enemy, but a door he has been walking toward since he was small enough to fit under a bench. It is a calm moment, the kind of calm that makes even the grass decide to be on its best behavior. The air has that particular clarity certain mornings have, when you can tell that the sky spent the night filing itself into smoothness. If there is fear here, it is the useful kind that remembers where the important objects were put away. Odin sets the spear down for a second, not as defeat, but as a person might set a pen down to sign more legibly. Even Kungnir understands that a signature wants a full hand. The songs make this part loud, but listen closely and you will hear how hushed it is. Fenrir opens his mouth, not like thunder, but like a door finally aligned to its frame. Odin steps forward as one would step into a bath of the exact right temperature. There is a small, pleased exhale from the part of him that has always liked correct measurements. A god fits inside a wolf the way a key fits the lock it deserves. It would be fashionable to call this violence, but it is more like the last page of a book finding the cover. The ravens do not flee. They file a report with the sky, which accepts. It stamps it with weather and places it where weather puts things. Somewhere beyond what eyes can follow, a loom pulls through one more weft with the kind of finality only practiced hands can make gentle. If this description makes you drowsy, that is fair. Apprentices often nap to the sound of looms, and the world is not mad about it. In the wake of that quiet, the ground remembers what it has to do. It is supposed to tremble, so it trembles, though not in a way to make drops jump from a cup. More, in the way thick soup shivers when someone sets the bowl down a touch too firmly. Fire shows up where it is invited, snow where it has always been invited, and both understand the itinerary. Vidar moves as if he has been rehearsing in a small room with a low ceiling, careful, efficient, with an intimacy only duty can give a body. That shoe, full of everyone else's leftovers, presses where it should. The jaw that has been the world's door closes on a counter-argument. In noisy versions of the tale, this is triumph over terror. In the sleepy version, it is a chore. Completed in good time, a latch slid into place at evening. The wolf, who is not wicked but necessary, does not complain in any human way. He has done a job and had a job done to him. There is a new kind of quiet after that, the quiet of rooms rearranged. People like to count what goes wrong at the end, but it is gentler to count what remembers to happen. The sea remembers to return what it has kept in its throat. The ash trees remember their taller cousins and grow more awake in memory. The sun, having carried a heavy schedule, leaves a note for the next sun with a small drawing of a path and a remark in the margin. Good luck. Take the long way past the hill with the blueberries. The mead in the hall goes to whomever is still there to drink it, and if no one lifts the cup does not mind. It has enjoyed being a cup a long time, and can enjoy being a quiet cup for a while. Frigg keeps the hearth warm because that is what hearts and hearths do when complicated things are happening far away. Someone finds Tyr's old gloves and puts them in a drawer with a label. The label's handwriting is not Odin's someone else's learning to keep track of things. Record keeping survives everything except forgetfulness. There is a story about a patch of ground where two goats had once eaten a tidy circle for years. After the world unwinds a little, new grass grows there in the same circle, as if expecting the goats to return to their assigned shift. I like to think the goats eventually do, punctual as ever. Another story says that one of the dwarves, who had been very proud of a hinge he made in his youth, retrieves it from a collapsed door frame and installs it on a chest for the new world. Hinges adore second chances. It's what they were made for. Children climb trees whose grandparents remember axes, and the trees approve of the climbing. Rivers, which only ever wanted a direction, get one. The wind swaps to a fresh shelf of smells wet bark, new iron, untroubled wool. It is all very ordinary, which is exactly the surprise dot as for Odin. The songs place him away, and then later place him back in ways that make scholars trace diagrams on napkins. But in the hush between those footnotes, you can hear a simpler truth. A god who liked to gather things has placed himself where all things are gathered. He becomes an excellent listener. If you are awake, you might enjoy the thought that his one-eyed attention is now a kind of weather, steady and impartial, the way good sunlight is. If you are asleep, he will keep his voice down. The Volf, too, ends up stored in the careful basket of the world's memory as a tool that did what tools do when they are used precisely right. There's no bitterness in the basket. There's linen to keep edges from scuffing each other, and the smell of cedar against moths. People say the world's end and imagine a door slamming. The story says the world's end and offers instead the last page of a chapter being pressed flat so the book doesn't puff on the shelf. Somewhere far ahead of this page, a green place waits with sun that looks like it has been ironed. Two figures, one you would recognize even without his old spear, and one with the kind of calm feet that learned patience next to a river. Walk and name things in the kind of voices that make names stick. They are not in a hurry. Names are not going anywhere. There are berries to test, water to praise, and stones to sit on while the wind performs its daily inventory. This is not the flashy victory people sometimes prefer. It is the victory of chores that never cease to be worthwhile, sometimes at night, in the houses that survive and the houses yet to be built. People will feel as though the rafters are listening. That will be the ravens who have learned how to sit very still and only rarely comment. Sometimes a shoe will creak on a floorboard, and someone will think kindly of that long, patient shoe that kept its promise when promises were almost too heavy to lift. Sometimes when a dog sighs in sleep and moves its paws as if running after a dream, there will be a brief glance toward the hills, and a quiet acknowledgement of the wolf who finished what had to be finished. The acknowledgement is not worship and not fear. It is the nod a craftsman gives when a tool is returned to its peg dot. We could count more details. If you like, how many shield bosses survive as toys, which tide first learns to fold itself on the near shore, the exact color of the first sunrise that does not remember the old sky very well yet. The accountants of fate have columns for all of it. But this is a bedtime kind of accounting where numbers are tucked in early and only the softest ones are allowed to stay up. The end of the world, after all, turns out to be a house cleaning, an audit that takes its time and writes its notes with a pleasant, even hand. If you are awake, let your mind stack these notes into small piles. If you are nearly asleep, let them slide together into a single smooth page. Either way, the story keeps its voice low and its steps light. There will always be another list to make and another morning to set a candle one thumb width left. And somewhere in that small adjustment lies everything the sagas meant when they whispered that endings, properly done, are mostly a way of making room